Dead Space. Inspired by its elder brother RE4, it single-handedly carried the AAA horror scene on its back. With its great environmental design, solid immersion, amazing combat, and breathtaking atmosphere, DS solidified its place as not just one of the best action horror games, but also one of the most universally loved games ever made. Glenn Schofield set out to create the scariest game ever made, and while not fully, but कुछ हद तक वो succeed भी हुए. However, in spite of how successful the first DS game was, Glenn Schofield and dev team के कुछ members left the studio in pursuit of new opportunities, जिसकी वजह से ये Redwood Shores, later called Western Games के बचे हुए members पर एक pressure था. Pressure of creating not just a great sequel, but also creating another masterpiece of the action horror genre, of not just making an epic continuation of our beloved Engineer, but also creating something that was much grander in scope. And so, after immense marketing and loads of silly advertisements, Dead Space 2 came out in 2011. So, let's grab our plasma cutter, recharge our stasis, grab our Kinesis module, and stomp some necros, because it's time for us to be whole once again. Dead Space 2 की स्टोरी स्टार्ट होती है with a short recap of DS1 के events, कि कैसे Isaac found himself in an extraordinary situation and survived the shithole that was Ishimura. Then the scene jumps to this interrogatory session, where we learn that ever since his exposure to the marker, he is suffering from dementia and weird hallucinations of Nicole. Then we jump to the present, where Isaac is finally woken up by a stranger named Franco. And just as we thought everything was alright, this happens.
Right now, I can explain everything, but you gotta trust me, okay? Listen. You're in terrible, terrible danger.
Soon the Titan station gets overwhelmed by the necromorphs and Isaac barely खुद की जान बचा के भागता है. उसके बाद we also come across Diana and a fellow mental patient named Strauss. वहाँ से हमारा objective एकदम clear है, and that is to work with various NPCs in the game to put an end to the outbreak. Honestly speaking, DS2 की story is just a solid continuation of DS1 की story. जहाँ पर DS1 was more focused on Isaac experiencing and getting traumatized by his trip to the Ishimura, DS2 is focused on how broken Isaac has become since that trauma, and how he feels guilty for pushing Nicole to take the job on the damn ship. Also, since Isaac is no longer a silent protagonist, ये गेम को allow करता है to further explore his psyche. And while Silas was better for more immersion in the world, but in context of DS2, I think giving Isaac a voice was a great choice. Especially Gunnar Wright did a phenomenal job as him. Another thing that I would like to praise DS2 for are the characters. First comes Strauss, who is the only person Isaac can directly relate to since he was driven mad by the marker during which he murdered his wife and son. This makes him quite tragic since he represents what Isaac can eventually become if he lets his guilt overpower him. Next comes Allie, who is a badass no bullshit lady who was turned into so after witnessing the stuff of nightmares on the Titan station. And the chemistry of her with Isaac is quite fun to watch.
It doesn't recognize the new junction.
I think I've got it from up here.
Just rewind from down here.
What? I didn't hear you.
Nothing. Nothing.
I did it. I got it started. There, there's a lift on the other side. I'll turn around. You can get on.
Thanks.
Overall, this journey of our beloved engineer एक emotional roller coaster था that kept me engaged for its entirety. And जब गेम की ending में Isaac थका हारा बैठ जाता है, it truly made me feel for him. However, there is still some issue with the story, that being main villain Tideman. As a main villain, he was quite generic and forgettable. Sure, वो time to time actually try करता है in trying to hunt Isaac down or block his path of progression, some leading to amazing set pieces, but his active involvement and proper interaction was quite less. And yeah, that pretty much sums up the story. Now let's into the cream of the crop, that is gameplay. And let me tell you, Dead Space 2 is not only a near perfect sequel to the original, but also what might be the greatest action horror game ever made. Just like Dead Space 1, Dead Space 2 का gameplay loop revolve करता है around limb dismemberment and using it as an effective ammo conservation method to further your chance at surviving the enemy encounters. However, there are a decent amount of improvements and changes that makes the combat even better and raises it from status of being good to phenomenal. सबसे पहले let's talk about the changes. So unlike DS1, DS2 opt करती है for a more traditional third-person shooter controls. That being ability to reload while running, a slightly lighter and faster ISAC, and more responsive aiming controls. Also, in order to compensate for it, गेम का combat pace has been ramped up to 11. यहाँ पर every necromorph is twice as fast as compared to Dead Space 1 and also attack in very large numbers. In addition, there are also improvements introduced to an already amazing combat system. सबसे पहले let's talk about the kinesis. तो जिन लोगों ने मेरी Dead Space 1 वाली वीडियो देखी है, they will know how useless kinesis was in combat. However, that changes from DS2 onwards. You see, not only kinesis grab is made a lot smoother, but also you can now pick up sharp objects in the environments and impale necros with it. And अगर ये काफी नहीं था, तो तुम उनके लिम्स को काट के भी उनकी तरफ वापस फेंक सकते हो. सिर्फ इतना ही नहीं, तुम एक्सप्लोरर का हैंड भी वापस फेंक सकते हो, just like the previous game. And even कुछ नए enemies को stasis करके उनके फास्ट प्रोजेक्टाइल्स भी उन पे वापस फेंक सकते हो. And this is what I love about DS2. यहाँ पर हर एक enemy is not only a threat, but also a solution to that threat within itself, like how their claws can be thrown back at them, whereas one that explodes, उनको dismember करा जा सकता है and then can be made to explode at the right time and place, thereby consuming less ammo. Also, since we are talking about enemies, I think it would be the right time to discuss enemy variety. तो सबसे पहले जो enemies Dead Space 1 में थे, वही enemies make a grand return and largely functions the same. लेकिन उसके अलावा कई नई enemy types भी ऐड करी गई हैं. सबसे पहले आते हैं हमारे pukers, जो कि as the name suggests will puke at you, which in return decreases your speed greatly for a limited time. Then आते हैं packs, who generally attack in large numbers, are agile but are very fragile, such that they can be killed by even a single barrel through kinesis. Then आते हैं crawlers, who are well transformed infants that again attack in groups and explode on getting near to you. Then आते हैं my personal favorite stalkers, जो कि as the name suggests stalks you in order to get an attack opening and by far are the scariest. फिर आते हैं cyst, जो कि largely works as a landmine, asking the player to double check for them ताकि they don't fuck you up. Then there are nest, who are often found in 0G areas and need a good amount of credits on defeat for you to invest in stuff. And बाकी सारे वो types हैं जो कि पिछली गेम से वापस आए हैं, namely slashers, infectors, leapers, lurkers, etc. And यहाँ पर हर एक enemy इतना tightly designed और well thought out है कि when all these various types blend and attack together, it creates quite a lot of dynamicity in the combat. या तुम crawler या फिर exploder के sensitive part को shoot करके उन्हें on point explode करा दोगे, या फिर kill them and save it for later use. या तुम उसको पहले ही मार दोगे, या फिर let enemies run into them for their doom. Also, since we were talking about the improvements, मैं specially mention करना चाहूँगा game के melee system को, जो कि बहुत ज़्यादा improve करा गया है. You see, in previous game का melee was useless in combat. In fact, only time वो useful था is for looting. However, DS2 makes actually very useful in preserving the ammo and is very well balanced, such that it's neither too overpowered कि तुम उसे exploit कर सको, or too underpowered कि तुम उसे enemies को ना मार सको. And just for the comparison, this is the stomp and melee from DS1. And this is stomp and melee from DS2. But yeah, all of this is good. लेकिन लेवल डिजाइन कैसा है? And I am glad to inform you that it is exactly the way it should have been. सबसे पहले let's talk about a major improvement from DS1 and that is environmental variety. You see, environmental design पहली गेम का भी बहुत सही था, लेकिन क्योंकि वो एक माइनिंग वेसल पे सेट थी, तो उतनी environmental variety नहीं देखने को मिलती थी. However, Dead Space 2 वो चीज चेंज करती है since it's set on a large space station. You go from a church to shopping complex, an elementary school, residencies, and even government sector. And while the level design is even more linear than the first game, but it's alright क्योंकि first game का level design was also not like too open-ended. Also, it's not like too linear क्योंकि you also get a level like Unitology Church which is very well interconnected. And कई जगह level design में काफी verticality भी थी to account for updated zero-G controls. Speaking of which, जहाँ पर DS1 में zero-G controls were quite limited and only allowed you to go from one point to another, DS2 में you are literally Iron Man. This brings on a whole new opportunities for dev team both in terms of set pieces and gameplay. यहाँ पर पूरा chance था कि controls disorienting हो सकते थे, but thanks to the dev team that they also decided to add an auto line button, जो कि बहुत helpful साबित होता है in case you run into one of these disorienting situations. Now अब तक हम बात कर चुके हैं गेम के combat की, enemy variety की और level design की, but another stuff that needs to be mentioned is game का progression. Just like previous game, DS2 का progression is quite similar. You have a shop, a workbench, you explore, engage with enemies, earn power nodes and credits which you can then use to either upgrade yourself and purchase new stuff. Simple yet quite effective. However, यहाँ पर कुछ improvements और changes भी करे गए हैं that make it even better than it already was. सबसे पहले, unlike first game जहाँ तुम various armor upgrades purchase करते थे in order to increase your inventory space, DS2 में however you get variety of suits जिन सब के अपने अलग अलग क्वालिटीज हैं. Like vintage suit तुम्हें डिस्काउंट दे सकता है on every item you purchase from the shop, तो वहीं पर security guard armor can help you get some bonus damage with pulse rifle, etc. etc. As for workbench, it is largely the same, although with much better pathway of upgrades. Also, तुम एक टाइम के बाद गेम की रिस्पेक्ट फीचर को अनलॉक कर लेते हो that allows you to remove all your upgrades for 5000 credits from either your armor/abilities or your weapon. And speaking of it, Dead Space 2 में यहाँ भी कई new additions और changes हैं. So सबसे पहले let's talk about some new additions. First comes Seeker Rifle, जो कि एक mid-range single shot weapon है that single-handedly destroys an enemy if you are precise. Next comes Javelin Gun, which as the name suggests, एक javelin fire करती है that can pin an enemy to the wall and उसका alternate fire can electrocute an enemy or two if shot at. Then comes Detonator, which of course detonates when an enemy is nearby. Although इसे ध्यान से यूज करना वरना तुम्हें भी डैमेज मिल सकता है. And lastly comes Hand Cannon, which is a hilarious unlockable for beating the game on a new game plus. बाकी हर एक weapon DS2 में makes return from DS1 and some of them are even better. Like the assault rifle no longer has that awful alternate fire and flamethrower is overall more fun to use. With that, I have nearly covered all of the major stuff about DS2 and it's finally the time कि मैं उन दो reasons पर focus करूं जिसकी वजह से ये गेम सीधा वन ऑफ द बेस्ट से बेस्ट ऑफ द बेस्ट एक्शन हॉरर गेम बन जाता है. सबसे पहले आता है गेम का डिफिकल्टी स्लाइडर दैट ऑनेस्टली ऑफर्स वैरायटी ऑफ एक्सपीरियंसेस फॉर वैरायटी ऑफ प्लेयर्स. अगर तुम नॉर्मल या इजी पर खेल रहे हो तो यू विल इजीली गेट योर स्टैंडर्ड एक्शन हॉरर एक्सपीरियंस. लेकिन इफ यू डिसाइडेड टू प्ले ऑन सर्वाइवल और जेलेट तो गेम कहीं ना कहीं सर्वाइवल हॉरर कैटेगरी में जाना शुरू कर देता है क्योंकि ऑन दीज डिफिकल्टीज यू गेट अ मच लोअर रिसोर्स काउंट एंड कई बार तो तुम्हें स्टोर से एमओ या हेल्थ खरीदना पड़ेगा जिसकी वजह से प्लेयर को फोर्स करा जाता है टू मेक टफ कॉम्बैट डिसीजंस, एक्टिवली कीप स्विचिंग वेपन्स एंड यूज एवरी इंच ऑफ हिज आर्सेनल टू गेट आउट ऑफ सिचुएशंस इफेक्टिवली, दैट टू विद मिनिमम रिसोर्स कंजम्पशन. एंड जब तुम वो चीज फाइनली अचीव कर लेते हो तो यू फील लाइक अ टोटल बैडएस. इनफैक्ट यही चीज गेम को उसके प्रीक्वल से बहुत ज्यादा रीप्लेबल बना देता है. द नेक्स्ट रीजन इज द बैलेंस. You see, the subgenre of action horror हमेशा से स्ट्रगल करता आ रहा है in finding the perfect balance between these two elements. Heck, even RE4 somewhat struggled with it as well. And while DS1 also nailed it, but DS2 is a strange beast. DS2 एक ऐसी गेम है that pushes both these elements to their limit. लेकिन at no point of time it feels like it crosses either of them. जैसे कि तुम ये ट्रेन सीक्वेंस ले लो. After fighting enough necros on the train, this happens. Yeah, sure, this is awesome, but what really makes it different from similar movements in other action horror games is that DS2 doesn't really sacrifice its atmosphere for delivering this epic movement. Rather than hearing some epic music, all you hear is loud screeching noises and all you see is a man trying his best to survive. As for games horror, it is still very much present in good shape and form. Now, कई लोगों का मानना है कि DS2 isn't as scary as the first DS game, which I do agree with. लेकिन it doesn't mean it's not scary at all. You see, क्योंकि Dead Space 2 तुम्हें नेक्रोस की ओरिजिन से और नहीं डरा सकती, तो naturally it shifts its primary focus from that to second pillar of horror, that is the fear of getting overwhelmed by an intelligent and agile threat, and ये चीज further enhance कर जाती है on higher difficulty. Also, I don't think anyone can forget the first encounter with stalkers, or a spoiler alert, a trip back to Ishimura. By all of this, it might be already clear how good DS2 is, but just in my typical fashion, there are some problems. In spite of all the improvements that were there, one thing that hasn't changed at all are the boss fights, which just like the previous game are dog shit. And secondly, while the game is very well balanced for the most part, but आखिर के 30 से 40 minutes suffered from a huge difficulty spike, especially the final boss was a bullshit RNG fuckfest. Also, इस गेम की एक DLC आई थी that adds DLC weapon to it, लेकिन प्रॉब्लम ये है कि वो DLC अब गेम में इंटीग्रेट कर दी गई है, meaning when you first time open the store, तुम्हें कई चीजें फ्री दिखेंगी, giving you unfair advantage earlier. So मैं तुम्हें recommend करूंगा to get them and dump it in your storage, never to be used again. And yeah, these are the only 3 major complaints of mine. With this, we can finally conclude the gameplay part, which is simply great. मुझे यहाँ पर कुछ ज्यादा कहने की जरूरत नहीं है क्योंकि दिस सीरीज इज नोन फॉर इट्स टॉप टियर साउंड डिजाइन, फिर चाहे वो एनवायरमेंटल एम्बियंस हो, वेपन साउंड्स हो, या फिर satisfying sound of dismembering a necromorph or mealing it. As for soundtrack, it's just as awesome as the first game. In short, it's amazing. So the final verdict is quite simple. Dead Space 2 might be the greatest action horror game I have ever played in my life. इस गेम के दोनों aspects work together rather than constantly overshadowing each other. With its great combat, replay value, amazing atmosphere and well-written story, Dead Space 2 gets an easy 9 out of 10. Easily a masterpiece, completely worth playing. Go play it now. Abhi ki abhi.